Right, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Good. Okay, sorry, I wasn't sure if you could do that. Hi, welcome everyone, where in the world you are, and goodness, you are all around the world. And our thanks to the Model UN for inviting us to be part of this terrific online event. And congrats to the team who put it together, because this is no mean feat to get 3 days of programming the way you've done it. So on my desk, I have a kaleidoscope. And every time I turn it, it reminds me that there is another way of seeing the same bits of the puzzle. And so we hope in this brief session to pique your interest and to stimulate you to see climate priorities with a slightly different lens. My name is Inge Relph, and I'm the founder and co-founder and executive director of Global Choices, which is a USA and Europe-based not-for-profit. Sharing our panel are two wonderful young women, Eve Acham from Uganda and Emma Wilkinson from London, UK. So spot the odd one out. Well, I clearly don't fit the normal Model UN youth criteria, but rather than Gen Z, I guess you could call me Gen P, as in Generation Pre, or maybe Generation Persistent. Because despite the popular rhetoric, many of my generation have been working towards the SDGs for years. And as young leaders, I hope you know that you have many allies amongst Gen P. And I can speak for my colleagues at Global Choices when I say how inspiring and motivating it is to work in a genuinely equal way with young leaders like Emma and Eve and leaders like yourself. Kofi Annan, whom I had the honor to serve, said the following: "You are never too young to lead and never too old to learn." And for sure, I know that. He also used to say that we are facing problems without a passport. And I like to think that we share a passion for a fairer world and can build on collective intelligence across generations to solve these problems. As a teen growing up in Africa, my aspiration was to work at the UN because it was a beacon of global values, and it still is, despite its flaws, and which I know you've been discussing these past few days. But spurred by the inequality I saw around me, the constant thread in my life has been standing up for social and environmental justice. Age does, however, give one an advantage of being able to look back. And so today, I thought I'd frame things for you around key moments that I think have contributed to our awakening, to our interdependence, our interconnectedness, and to this hopeful moment in time that we at Global Choices believe is the greatest opportunity in generations to turn our collective aspirations into reality. COVID, for sure, is providing a brutal and provocative opportunity to recognize afresh that the problems we face today have no boundaries, no race, no gender, no political ideologies, and must therefore be met also with solutions that transcend those boundaries. So why finally are we able to see things differently now? For sure, we are at the tipping point of an unprecedented economic, ecological, and social meltdown. But we also have an unprecedented groundswell of change makers, from youth, environmentalists, ecologists, business, the arts, sciences, and even increasingly policymakers themselves, coming together in movements and holding government and institutional feet to the fire in far, far great numbers than we've ever seen. And in a recent survey, nearly 80% of people wanted a better, fairer, greener post-COVID world. And I'd encourage you to go to our website, and we are having a poll on what sort of world you would like to see post-COVID. So do let us know what your thoughts are. So let's just remind ourselves of the big events over the past 10 years that have provoked awareness that we have choices, and they must be global, but also relevant to the local. The 2008 financial crash woke us to that inescapable reality, that what happened in New York would profoundly affect the rest of the world and be felt in New Delhi. Whilst financial institutions worked together on the solutions, and though they were global solutions, they sadly fell very short of being inclusive and it exacerbated, in fact, the gap between the rich and the poor. But two more progressive events that recognize global interdependence were in 2015, of course, under the auspices of the UN. And I'm talking about the landmark agreement of the SDGs and the unprecedented agreement in Paris with 194 states signing up on climate. These set the bar that solutions that finally recognize that it's systems, not silos, that are the way forward, because we are one interconnected humanity. We're dependent on one another, and we're dependent on the earth that sustains us. So another lesser recognized aspect is the role women and feminine energy played in getting to these more holistic solutions. I'm thinking of how the UNSG's climate envoy, President Mary Robinson, for whom I was working at the time, together with the remarkable Christiana Figueres, insisted that there be gender balance and inclusion in all the UNFCCC working committees. And this was the same line that Graça Machel and her colleagues took for the SDGs. And I do believe this has contributed significantly to the better outcomes, because it better reflected the priorities of a wider range of people and not just political interest. So when Sally Rani, my co-founder, and I sat down to envisage what would an organization look like that is fit for purpose to tackle these global issues, we decided that it needed to be called Global Choices, because we do have choices. It needed to be genuinely intergenerational and not just have a token youth arm. It needed to be genuinely inclusive, especially of the marginalized, because it's their world too. It needed to be science-based, which is absolutely critical. And it needs to incorporate indigenous wisdom. Remember that about a quarter of the world's surface is under the management of indigenous people. And of course, it needed to be feminine-led. And although we are female-led, what we mean is that feminine energy, which is beyond gender, and is much more about the capacity to set self aside and to think of the greater good, a capacity that is found in men and women who operate with a generosity of spirit. And the call of the UN has always been to remember our humanity. And we believe that this consciousness that we are only ever as strong as the weakest, and that the strong have a responsibility to protect the weak, is one of the ways we recover our compassion and humanity. And this consciousness, this sense of oneness, extends to all living systems, including nature in all her beautiful biodiversity. Being awake to this is what we are trying to cultivate. And then there's SDG 17, our favorite SDG. We know we will only make real progress if we build collaborations with fresh thinkers and bold doers. And so here we have our home, this one vulnerable earth, this amazing, unimaginably beautiful, complex, diverse system of life support. Collectively known as the global commons, these life support systems, like the major systems like the forests, which are often called the lungs of the planet, and the oceans that supply every fourth breath of oxygen that we take, and the icy poles that act like thermostats on the earth and regulate the climate systems. We want to foster that sense of awe at how beautifully these systems support us, and how we, as global citizens who understand the importance of the global commons, can step up and take responsibility for them, to defend them as if our lives and all life on earth depends on them, because it does. And remember that the opposite of hate is, the opposite of love, is not in hate, but indifference. So the opposite of love is not hate, but indifference. And I applaud you all, because you're modeling the way forward and bringing others on board, because showing up is in itself an act of love. And the very good news is that we have a window of opportunity to choose design over disaster. Hope, which I know is one of the themes of this meeting, is not enough. We require more focused action. And what we are seeing is that whilst there's a huge increase in climate action, and I'm sure many of you are engaged in planting trees, removing plastic from the ocean, fighting for carbon reduction, all of which is crucial, there is little prioritization. And all the while, the most threatened and threatening of the global commons, the polar ice, is melting. And folks, we can keep planting trees, we can keep taking plastics out the ocean, but we can't plant ice. Once it's gone, it's gone. And so I'm going to ask Emma to explain a little more why this matters so much and what we can do about it. And then we'll make sure there's some time for questions afterwards. Thank you. Emma, over to you.
Thank you very much, Inge. I want to first echo Inge in welcoming you all and thank you for showing up and leading by example. It's lovely to be joined by you all. So my name is Emma Wilkinson, and I'm 22 years old, and I'm the coordinator of Arctic Angels, a programme of global choices, which I'll tell you a little bit more about towards the end of my part of this session. As you've just heard, we at Global Choices believe in seeing the whole, and when you take a step back, seeing the whole means seeing the ice. And when collating all the information and thinking strategically about the climate action needed, it becomes clear that not only does ice matter, but it needs to be urgently prioritised, as Inge said. But why? The polar ice is a thermostat, and just as the forest lands are thought of as the lungs, as Inge said, the polar ice is like the fridge, it's the regulator. And just as ice cubes have a significant cooling effect on a glass of water like this, the polar ice has a significant and irreplaceable cooling effect on the Earth. It's critical for global climate security, and therefore, whether we like it or not, we all have a vested interest in the polar ice. It's therefore what we think of as a global common. Melting ice caps and crashing glaciers have been increasingly imagined and represented in the media. And the melting of ice, I think a lot of people are aware now, will have huge ramifications, from disastrous sea level rise to disrupted ocean currents that entirely change our climate, compromising food and water security, and perpetuating a whole host of social issues. So I want to start this part of the workshop by a few questions. Firstly, on temperature, and secondly, on ice melt, and thirdly, the exploitation of the polar regions. They're multiple choice, so please feel free to write them in the chat and see what everybody else thinks. So the first one, what is the highest temperature to ever be recorded in the Arctic? The answer to this is actually the highest temperature, 100.4 or 38 degrees C. And this was recently recorded in a Siberian town during a heat wave. The records began in 1885, so this is the hottest there has been since then. And these are also reported alongside reports of wildfires, or zombie fires, they're sometimes referred to as. And for those of you who tuned in to the Model Arctic Council session with Dr. Anthony Specker, you'll know that now, if you didn't before, that the Arctic really is a lived environment, and it's not wholly barren as sometimes imagined. So you can imagine that wildfires and temperatures like this will have significant impact on those who live there, from their livelihoods to the air quality in their environment, as well as having a larger knock-on impact for the global community. So I want to show you this map of surface temperature to contextualize that stat a little more. You can see a very clear trend unfolding as time goes on, so I'll just leave it for a second. Bear in mind that this is only compared to the 1950s to the 1980s relative to that period. So if it was compared to pre-industrial times, you would see it be even redder. And very high up in the Arctic, you can now see how red it is, and this is called Arctic amplification. And it means that it's warming faster. Actually, the Arctic is warming twice as fast as the global rate. To further contextualise this and expand out to the Arctic and include the Antarctic too, I wanted to draw attention to recent media reports that have all been released in 2020. Antarctic records, temperature records were first released at the very end of 2019, but will continue to be reported and confirmed. You can see the middle one in the top, 7th of February 2020. And then the Arctic Circle temperatures, the heat wave that I was just referring to, you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, 22nd of June 2020. So this is really recent news. And I want to say that the intention here by kind of collating all of these screenshots is not to prompt eco-anxiety or alarm you, which I'm quite conscious of personally, but just to make you aware of the global attention that the poles are receiving. And now, naturally, moving on to the next question, temperature is often thought of alongside ice melt as well in regard to the poles. So this leads me to my next question of how much ice is Greenland losing per year? 155 million, 400 billion, or 234 billion? And I can see some guesses are coming in. So 234 billion tons is actually the answer here. According to NASA and the European Space Agency, between 1992 to 2018, Greenland lost 3.8 trillion tons of ice. And its current rate of ice loss has accelerated from 25 billion to 234 billion tons per year. This wasn't supposed to happen until 2070. And I think, though, that sometimes these stats and these really, really huge numbers can feel quite inconceivable. So I've included this graphic, and I'm just going to pause it a second while I tell you that this animation of sea ice, the whiter area is the older sea ice. So I would encourage you to focus on that as you watch this graphic. It's multi-year ice, and you'll be able to see that it, my mouse, there we go, that it contracts and expands with summer and winter. So the minimum is recorded in September after summer, and the maximum is generally tended to be recorded in March after winter, when it will have expanded to its almost full potential. And you can clearly see as the time frame moves on now, a drastic change over the past 40 years. And this has enormous implications for the wildlife. For example, polar bears, they rely on seals as a food source, and seals rely on sea ice. And I know that just in the last few days, there have been recent reports of a study released in Nature of polar bears being expected to possibly no longer be around by 2100. Yeah, so I'm sure a lot of you will have seen them possibly. And ice melt also, as well as the ecological impact, has significant effect on other positive feedbacks, for example, the albedo effect. And as melting ice uncovers the darker land or the darker ocean beneath, more sunlight is absorbed, causing further warming and further heating and warmer temperatures. Just briefly, I don't have time to explore this fully, but I just wanted to mention sea level rise and the impacts that ice melt can have on that. For example, in Antarctica, ice draining from the Thwaites Glacier alone already accounts for 4% of annual sea level rise. It's actually been termed the Doomsday Glacier, that glacier. And I think that it's really important to remember that sea level rise will and is already having a huge impact on low-lying megacities, which are fundamental to the world's economy and where a lot of the world's population lives. So I included this quote by Professor Henry Pollock, a professor of geophysics at the University of Michigan. "Nature's best thermometer and most unambiguous indicator of climate change is ice. Ice asks no questions, presents no arguments, reads no newspapers, listens to no debates. It is not burdened by ideology, and it carries no political baggage as it crosses the threshold from solid to liquid. It just melts." And I think this throws into sharp relief our vulnerability. The ice will melt regardless of our news reporting, for example, the reports I just showed you a few slides ago, or our awareness. We really need our awareness and understanding to translate to prioritise action that protects the ice. And not only do we have to worry about ice melt, but we also have to worry about willful harm of the remaining polar ice. And so this leads me to my third and final question: which commercial natural resources are extracted from Antarctica? So the answer here is actually none. It's against the Antarctic Treaty to extract natural resources beyond research and science. And this does not mean to say Antarctica is not of concern. The treaty is up for renewal in 2048 and resource extraction is being considered. And as we've just discussed, ice melt is an ongoing problem there. This, however, is not the case for the Arctic, and exploitation is happening now. And this leads me to talk to you about our work for Hands Off the Arctic. Our Hands Off campaign confronts policymakers, corporations, and individuals with plans to willfully harm the ice, calling for its urgent protection. Particularly, these plans include oil and gas drilling and deep sea mining. And whilst there isn't time today to explore the politics and the dynamics of all of it, I want to, for a minute, hone in on deep sea mining. Deep sea mining for rare earth minerals has been presented as an environmental solution and crucial to a renewable energy future. And plans are afoot to pursue it around the world, including in the Arctic. However, this will have catastrophic impacts. It will destroy wildlife's habitats, and the noise pollution will also cause displacement. The deep sea has unique creatures, for instance, zombie worms that can't survive elsewhere, and deep sea mining will create dead zones, which will have not only an impact on the wildlife living in that vicinity, but the wider ocean food chain as a whole. And what's more, the deep sea stores blue carbon that's naturally absorbed by marine life and stored in the sediment in the ocean floor, and it slows climate change. The risk of expediting climate change is therefore huge by mining the seafloor. And altogether, little is known about the deep sea floor. It's barely been explored, and we should act with the precautionary principle, we believe, meaning not acting until we know the risks, pausing, reviewing, and collating all the information, and if we don't know, waiting until we do know. We currently have an opportunity to place a 10-year moratorium on deep sea mining, giving us time to develop our knowledge and alternatives from which renewable energy can be developed. You can find out more about this and by particularly looking at the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition, so I'd encourage you to do some Googling and check them out as well. Our Hands Off campaign wholeheartedly supports this moratorium. We believe that we should stop willful harm of all precious global commons. While talking about Hands Off, I also just wanted to note this recent news that has affirmed the urgency of our Hands Off campaign. It was an oil spill in Arctic Siberia on May 29th, 2020, and it actually didn't reach larger media until the 4th of June, the day before World Environment Day, and it was sobering news to hear then. You can see in the headlines that it's spilling into Arctic Glacial Lake as the cleanup, as you can see on the top headline, effort continues as well. I would encourage you all to look at this event that portrays the dangers and the harm of business as usual. So with our Hands Off campaign, I want to tell you a little bit about Arctic Angels, as I promised when I first introduced myself. And this is what I coordinate. It's an intergenerational action network empowering youth. Our Arctic Angels are young women collaborating to show that there is power when they bring their voices together to produce a ripple effect for a more sustainable, a more just, and a more biodiverse world for everybody. And our Arctic Angels are mobilizing globally. And when I say this, I don't just mean that they are mobilizing around the globe, but that they're mobilizing as global citizens with a global view. So I just want to explain the two photos. We have at the top our first Arctic Angel, Astra Detterman. She's age 8 here, and she's lobbying congressmen and women for the protection of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And below we have our Hands Off the Arctic signs at the New York City Climate March in 2019, September. A lead organizer of this was Shea Bastida, one of our Arctic Angels as well. And they had 300,000 people come out to the streets. So it was really awesome. Here are some of our Arctic Angels across the globe. Unfortunately, I don't have time to tell you all about these phenomenal young women, but I would encourage you to go to arcticangels.org, and you'll see our website address come up on the final slide at the end of this as well, and have a read of their short bios and look at the work that they're doing in their own spheres. All our angels have diverse experiences and specific interests that their work is relative to, just as I do as well. And they're all united, though, under the shared goal of preventing willful harm of the ice. So finally, I just want to show you one way that we have in the past captured attention for our Hands Off campaign. And this was at the 2020 World Economic Forum, where the mission was to improve the state of the world. We launched our Beanie campaign calling for better governance of these critical ecosystems, and really just pushing for an understanding of the importance of the poles to the interconnected global ecosystem. Our beanies were actually made from unique reprieve yarn, and each beanie is 4 plastic bottles that would have otherwise entered our oceans. And through this, we really wanted to demonstrate the interconnectedness of all these issues. So finally, this leads me to my last question of what you guys would do to capture attention and protect the Arctic. We would be very interested to know, and we'd encourage you to think about in your community and beyond that as well. At the end of the presentation, as I said, you'll see our email address and also our contact information, and we'd love to hear from you with your ideas. When thinking about capturing global attention, it's important to think whose attention you're wanting to grab: policymakers, celebrities, your peers. And I just want to end on a final note of saying that everyone has different strengths, and the true magic comes from when they collaborate. So to capture attention and work to protect something like the Arctic, you don't necessarily have to be a public speaker. You could contribute in so many other ways through design, creative writing, scientific research. That's all from me for now. I now want to introduce Evelyn, our Arctic Angel, who has been capturing attention globally for over a year now. So welcome, Eve, everybody.
Thank you so much, Emma, for the wonderful presentation. Thank you, Inge. My name is Evelyn Acham. I'm a climate activist from Uganda, and I'm also an Arctic Angel. As an African woman from a landlocked country where we only experience 2 seasons, the rainy and dry, we don't have snow. Most people have only watched snow in movies, but I am here fighting for the Arctic. It feels to me that majority of climate activists are focused on conservation and protection of forests, and that they don't know very much about the polar regions. I believe that all our global commons are equally important, and that we need to think globally. Personally, at first, I thought I was fighting to save a tree. Then I thought I was fighting to save a rainforest. Now I realize that I'm fighting for humanity and the whole world. I was surprised to learn that about 4 million people live in the Arctic, as well as unique species, most of which may not be found elsewhere in the world. I feel a responsibility to speak up for all people. All people feel the same way, and I believe that we are all one together. This global view makes me a global citizen, and this means that I care about the Arctic and all the life that lives there. All systems and our global commons are connected. As you have heard, what happens in the Arctic does not stay there, and the solution to the problems the Arctic is facing do not lie in the Arctic alone. This is why I'm an Arctic Angel and a global citizen. In Uganda and around me, people are dying in devastating floods. This May 2020, residents in Kasese district in Western Uganda woke up to floods that wreaked havoc on livestock, crops, and human life. This displaced 8,000 people. Floods are an ongoing problem. This is not an unusual event. So we see that people's livelihoods are continuing to be lost. Increasing water levels are rising, and this is a huge problem. A few years ago, it took 3 years for continued rain to make the levels of Lake Victoria overflow. But this year, it took only 6 months for alarming levels to be reached. They are expected to even rise more, which have resulted to floods and some homes. Beaches like Speak Resort Munyonyo in Uganda have been submerged, displacing and leaving thousands of people homeless. Flooding water is also a breeding place for mosquitoes, which cause malaria, which has increased mortality rates in children and other diseases like cholera. As well, we have had prolonged droughts that have left the large population without water needed to survive. Erratic rain increases post-harvest storage losses of crops typically dried in the sun. It is the poor and vulnerable who feel these impacts the hardest. They will go hungry and even remain very poor for the rest of their lives. There are many health issues linked to these too, from immune disorders to birth defects. As well, loss of businesses and property leads to children dropping out of school. More teenage girls are being given away for marriage as property in exchange for money as a way of survival. Domestic violence also caused by disagreements in homes as a result of poverty, as a result of the impacts of climate change, which leads to frustration and lack of peace in homes. As you can see, it is all connected. The physical impacts and the social impacts cannot be separated. Uganda has been called the Pearl of Africa in the past because of its weather. It was known for having 2 rainy seasons every year. It has been thought of as one of the world's diverse nations. However, 2 rainy seasons are not happening anymore. This change is happening while the population is busy surviving. The impacts of climate change are so severe and visible, but majority care less to find out the cause as well. While nobody is watching, nature is being willfully destroyed, and this will cause lifetime impacts that will affect so many generations to come. For example, Makshon Falls in Uganda is under attack. The government wants to convert it into a power station to generate about 360 megawatts of power. As well, Mabira Forest, the largest forest in Uganda, is being cleared. 70 square kilometers has been destroyed. It looks empty, and this breaks my heart. We no longer see the beauty that we used to see. I wonder if Uganda will still be called the Pearl of Africa 10 to 20 years from now. What inspired me to do my activism most was watching my friend and colleague Vanessa Nakate's individual strikes on the streets of Kampala. Seeing the passion and vigor that this young woman had for the planet triggered my interest. I have interacted with a couple of friends, and it's surprising that most of them don't have any idea about climate change. How come people are not aware? The system fails to address climate change, particularly the education system, which did not and still does not do us justice because it doesn't emphasize the urgent need of climate action. It simply brushes on the surface. As well, the system does not support activists because in Uganda, group and individual strikes are hard to do without being arrested. I remember the first time I stood on the streets of Kampala to do my first individual strike. I was very scared. As I continued standing with my placards, people walked to me to ask questions about what I was doing and why. People stopped to read the messages on my placards. This gave me hope to continue advocating for this. So, how do I capture attention? I put my work and my strikes on social media with strong messages. I also collaborate with different activists. We all have different knowledge and we share and support one another. Talking to people in my circles generates more interest and people want to join. It is so important to talk both to friends and strangers about this. I believe talking to people is the best strategy. Being part of networks is also very important. The support from my peers and motivation this gives me is tremendous. As well as being an active angel, I'm also a national coordinator of the Rise Up movement. I help mobilize and organize different activities like group strikes in strategic points, like petrol stations, malls, road junctions. During the lockdown, I also organize digital campaigns. You can see us in the photos there. I also organize school strikes where we go to primary schools and teach students about climate change and the impacts that are happening already. We organize the school program once a week, visit 2 schools each week. However, we have not been able to go back to schools ever since the lockdown, but we are planning to make this bigger and cover more schools. We also carry out activities like garbage collection. We usually target busy places like food markets where we go and first pick up all the litter like plastic. By doing that, you capture their attention. So as we collect the litter, 2 to 3 of us are talking to the people in the community about the dangers of plastics and the impacts of climate change. What do we do now? We need to listen to the scientists. We need to listen to stories from different activists and people, especially those from the most affected communities. We need to amplify their voices. They all have different solutions that can work together. We need people to come together and we need willingness from the governments, the leaders, and the policymakers. I think we need to focus on informing ourselves and the people around us. I believe that this is our biggest problem. We all see that the impacts of climate change affect everyone. It doesn't matter your race, ethnicity. Its impacts affect all of us. When the ice melts and sea levels rise, we all affected, but the poor are hit the hardest because they lack the resources that can help them adapt to the effects. If we work collectively, we will see very fast change. Many heads are better than one. Through working together, we'll be able to share ideas and learn from each other. I believe this will also change people's perspectives and encourage them to think globally and think of the polar ice and all our global commons. Thank you for listening to me. I would like to introduce Emma to continue.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that with us, Eve. You're awesome. And I find it personally inspiring to hear all about your work, your drive, and your holistic perspective. So Eve has already shared with you her views on what we need to do now, her call to action, as it were. I want to build upon that and share 3 action points with you. First, intrinsic to our message today is that a global problem requires a global solution, global collaboration. Secondly, that we need to take wise and prioritized action, and we need to move out of echo chambers as we collaborate and use collective intelligence to make strategic choices. And for us, and that is protecting the polar ice, because once it's gone, as Inge said at the start of the session. And finally, this is a personal call to action from myself. I want to encourage you all to be curious, to ask questions, and to think critically as you continue to learn. As young people, I think that we need to challenge the status quo and challenge facts and rules that we're told and taught. As Sir Robert Swan said, the greatest threat to our planet is the belief that somebody else will save it. And this leads me to our final kind of slide, as I ask you, what will you do today? Sometimes after workshops such as these, little action can be taken whilst people learn a lot and they're informative and people show up, which is amazing. So I want to encourage you all to make pledges and even to submit them into the chat below if it helps you hold yourselves accountable and also inspire each other if you have one that pops to mind straight away. So thank you all again for joining us and sticking around to the end. Thank you also to MUN Impact for the opportunity. Here you can see all of our contact information, our websites and social media. So please do connect with us. As I said before, we would welcome your support of our Hands Off campaign, and we would very much like to hear ideas from you fresh thinkers. Also, we are actively recruiting as our Arctic Angels network grows, so please do apply to be an Arctic Angel if you're interested. A form can be found on the homepage of arcticangels.org, or you can always just reach out and email us with more questions, or on social media if it's easier. As well, if you'd like to take a little more look in depth into the issues that we skimmed the surface of today, on globalchoices.org we have a resource library where you can find various articles on these issues and related topics. So I would encourage you all to head over there to learn more. Thank you everyone for your time. I hope you found this session informative and motivating, and I guess we'll move on to questions now.
Actually, thank you. That was such an amazing presentation, but we actually only have 3 minutes left. So I'm afraid questions a little. Maybe we can take one or two questions. One second. All right, so Noah asked, I was wondering about the effect of rising sea levels on ocean currents. What effect will the changing sea currents have on climate change?
So, so there are the Gulf Stream, that's a key current. Meltwater from the Greenland ice sheet will slow the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation. It's called the AMOC, and the system of ocean currents that drives and controls the well-known Gulf Stream. I'd encourage you to do some more research and Google a little bit more on the Gulf Stream, as well as the jet stream. That is a really strong influencer over climate in Europe, the globe, as we've said, everything is so connected, and also the Americas as well. So yeah. Do we maybe have one more for Eve or Inge?
Yes, we can take one more. Habiba? Okay, I'll just go ahead. Vihan asked, how long do we have left to make a difference before the result of all this will be irreversible?
Oh, Inge, you're muted. I think Inge is trying to answer this question because she is the perfect person to answer that. I'll ask to unmute you. I think maybe because she's not a host.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, now I'm unmuted. Just very quickly in relation to the previous question, the other thing that, as Emma was saying, it changes the dynamics of the flow of water. And what we are seeing is that the air currents slow. And so we are seeing that storms are going to be much, much bigger, and they will stall like we had last year over the Bahamas, if you remember how slow moving those storms are. And they're much, much, much more destructive. And that is one of the things that is being connected with the change in the water currents and the ocean currents. How long have we got? Well, not long enough, that's for sure. Johan Rockström would say 10 years is probably, we're getting to the point where there's irreversible tipping point. And it's quite frightening to think about that, because some of this will depend on how fast we can decarbonize. So how fast can we actually get to 1.5 degrees? And there is a lot of activity in that space, but can that happen fast enough? I don't know. I mean, we do have to also start thinking about the other scenarios of what will happen if we can't stop this melting. And whilst there are lots of people waiting, or companies and businesses waiting to pounce into the space and ship and have shipping lanes and exploit the oceans, as Emma was saying, and willfully break up the ice, that's the thing we have to stop. But you know, it might be gleeful for some, but for I think there are about, if I remember, 200 million people living on the coast. And that's below sea level, below the 5 meters from sea level. And I think that when you think of the impact of that, it should spur us on to take action and to really push our policymakers to say, hands off, let's protect at least what we have. And let's not allow willful harm of the ice. There's no reason why we should be oil and gas drilling at this point. And just because we can explore under the oceans now, doesn't mean we have to. And we need to make our voices heard. And we would love you to join our Hands Off campaign.
Thank you so much. We've come to the end of the session. Unfortunately, we could only take 2 questions, but I hope all the participants have noted down their contact information. You can contact them there. And also, I've also put a link in the chat, which is the feedback form from Emran Impact. Please check that out too. And I hope you all enjoyed this session. It was very insightful. So thank you for that, speakers. But now, thank you everyone for coming. You can move on to the next sessions now. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.